You stand on a gravel shoulder along the Trans-Canada Highway in northern Ontario, watching birch trees, pink granite outcrops, and calm brown water beside the road. Trucks rumble past, heading toward Manitoba. It looks like an endless, unchanging wilderness that has sat undisturbed for thousands of years. But the ground beneath the asphalt is moving upward at a rate measured in millimeters every single year. The Canadian landmass hides some of the largest, least understood geographical anomalies on the planet, tucked directly beside everyday towns and highways. What is remarkable is not that these phenomena exist, but that millions of people pass them every decade without realizing the landscape is defying basic geographic assumptions. How much of what we assume about the geography of Canada is simply an illusion created by incomplete maps? Later in this countdown, we will look at a paved mountain pass that climbs above 2,000 meters into alpine tundra, and an entire town that was built, fully equipped, and completely abandoned in a matter of months. For generations, people assumed the Canadian Shield and its surrounding terrain were static, ancient landforms that had settled into permanent stability after the last ice sheet retreated. That assumption was entirely reasonable for 2 centuries, supported by early land surveys and standard topographic mapping that treated rock and water as fixed backdrop. The first crack in that belief appeared when modern geodetic measurements and airborne radar began revealing that the crust, the lake basins, and the river networks are actively shifting, draining, and reshaping themselves in real time. The ghost town of Cobalt, Ontario. Drive off Highway 11 into Cobalt, and you see ordinary timber frame houses and paved roads cut into granite. Beneath sits a subterranean maze. Silver was discovered here in 1903 during construction of the Temiskaming and Northern Ontario Railway, launching one of the richest mineral rushes in Canadian history. By 1911, Cobalt produced over 30 million ounces of silver annually, and miners carved more than 100 kilometers of underground shafts directly underneath the residential district. Mining companies drained entire lakes, including Cobalt Lake, to access vein structures exposed on the lakebed. When the boom collapsed in the 1930s, shafts were sealed or abandoned, but miles of timber-supported stopes remained beneath streets and yards. The town site sits on a hollowed-out bedrock honeycomb, monitored by the Ontario Geological Survey for structural subsidence. The source of the Fraser River at Moose Lake. Most people picture the Fraser River as the wide, silt-laden waterway cutting through the lower mainland near Vancouver. Its origin lies more than 800 kilometers to the northeast, in the Rocky Mountains near Yellowhead Pass. The river begins as a clear trickle seeping out of an alpine meadow at Fraser Pass, sitting at an elevation of 2,015 meters near the Continental Divide. It flows into Moose Lake, a narrow glacial body of water along Highway 16, where meltwater from hanging glaciers feeds the main channel. From this quiet mountain basin, gravity and rainfall drive the river across 1,375 kilometers of terrain, carving through the Fraser Canyon before discharging 20 million tons of sediment into the Strait of Georgia every year. Vulcan, Alberta, and its rural spaceport. Sitting in the flat prairie of southern Alberta, 60 kilometers south of Calgary, Vulcan appears at first to be a standard agricultural service center dominated by grain elevators. Founded in 1910 by a Canadian Pacific Railway surveyor who named local stations after Roman mythology, the municipality shared its name with the fictional home planet in the Star Trek franchise. In the 1990s, local planners leaned into the coincidence to offset the decline of traditional rural railways. The town constructed a station shaped like a starship, erected a replica of the USS Enterprise along Highway 23, and established a tourism registry. What looks like an isolated farming hamlet of 1,800 people hosts international conventions, drawing visitors to a geographic namesake created purely by a railway worker's naming list. Highwood Pass, Alberta. Highway 40 winds through Kananaskis country southwest of Calgary, climbing steadily until it reaches Highwood Pass at an elevation of 2,206 meters above sea level. This is the highest paved public road in Canada. Built in the 1950s for forestry access and upgraded to asphalt in the 1970s, the highway penetrates directly into the alpine zone, where trees give way to scree slopes and dwarf willow. Environment and Climate Change Canada records snow at the summit in every month of the year, and provincial authorities close a 44-kilometer stretch from December to June to protect wintering bighorn sheep and grizzly bear corridors. Drivers can ascend from dense subalpine spruce forest to wind-scoured alpine tundra without leaving the pavement, reaching an elevation higher than many major peaks in eastern North America. The cold pool of Snag, Yukon. Located off the Alaska Highway near the White River, the former village of Snag looks like an ordinary lichen-covered valley floor surrounded by low mountains. On February 3, 1947, a meteorologist at the local emergency airstrip recorded a temperature of minus 63.0 degrees Celsius. It remains the lowest officially verified surface temperature ever recorded in North America. The extreme cold was produced by microclimate geography. A high-pressure system trapped stagnant Arctic air in a bowl-shaped valley, while clear skies allowed terrestrial radiation to escape into space. Dense, frozen air drained down from surrounding hills and settled in the depression, creating a thermal inversion so intense that exhaust from vehicles froze instantly into ice fog, and sound carried for kilometers across the frozen muskeg. The rising floor of Hudson Bay. The vast expanse of Hudson Bay appears static on bathymetric maps, but the Earth beneath it is lifting at one of the fastest rates recorded on the planet. During the last glacial maximum, the Laurentide ice sheet was up to 4 kilometers thick directly over the Canadian Shield, depressing the continental crust into the underlying mantle. Since the ice melted roughly 8,000 years ago, the land has been undergoing post-glacial rebound. Precise GPS surveys conducted by the Canadian Geodetic Survey show the region surrounding Hudson Bay is rising by up to 12 millimeters per year. Shallow coastlines near Churchill, Manitoba are steadily retreating as the seafloor turns into dry land, adding hectares of new terrain to the continent every century. The lake network of Quetico Provincial Park. Spanning more than 4,800 square kilometers in northwestern Ontario, Quetico Provincial Park presents a solid forest canopy when viewed from above. Beneath the trees sits a glacial drainage maze holding over 2,000 interconnected lakes, carved into billion-year-old Precambrian granite by advancing and retreating ice sheets. The water network contains virtually no roads. Instead, short glacial portage trails link waterways that served as primary transport corridors for indigenous nations and later fur traders. The Canadian Hydrographic Service notes that the density of lakes on the Canadian Shield means that within this park, a traveler is rarely more than 2 kilometers from a navigable body of fresh water. Common loon monitoring on Canadian lakes. The eerie call of the common loon is widely treated as a marker of untouched northern wilderness, yet Environment and Climate Change Canada tracks dense breeding populations across heavily developed recreational lakes. Surveys conducted by Birds Canada under the Canadian Lakes Loon Survey estimate thousands of territorial breeding pairs across southern and central Canadian waters. In 1981, standardized monitoring began tracking reproductive success, measuring the ratio of 6-week-old chicks per pair. The birds require open water bodies of at least 10 hectares simply to take flight, as their high body density prevents rapid takeoff. Despite shoreline cottage construction and powerboat traffic on bodies of water such as Lake Muskoka and Rideau Lake, loons continue to nest on floating vegetation platforms within meters of active docks. Their persistence relies on continuous water level management and local conservation efforts to minimize lead sinker ingestion and wake erosion. The Olympic legacy of Montreal and Calgary. Large international sporting events typically belong to expanding metropolises, yet host venues frequently leave unexpected permanent marks on local topography. Montreal hosted the 1976 Summer Olympic Games, constructing the Olympic Stadium with its tilted inclined tower, which stands 165 meters high as the tallest inclined structure in the world. 12 years later, Calgary hosted the 1988 Winter Olympic Games, transforming a flat prairie landscape at Canada Olympic Park into an artificial winter sports facility using synthetic snowmaking systems and concrete ski jumps rising 90 meters over the Bow River Valley. These structures altered local skylines and municipal land use permanently across both cities. Decades after the events closed, the specialized venues remain active training facilities and major public landmarks embedded directly within urban neighborhood grids. The exposed anorthosite of the Grenville Province. Hikers climbing high ridges across the Canadian Shield often observe scoured pale gray to white rock surfaces that reflect sunlight far more intensely than surrounding granite. This light-colored bedrock is anorthosite, a rare plutonic rock composed almost entirely of plagioclase feldspar. Formed deep within the continental crust approximately 1.1 billion years ago during the Grenville orogeny, a massive mountain-building event that forged the supercontinent of Rodinia, the rock cooled slowly under intense pressure. Subsequent erosion over hundreds of millions of years removed kilometers of overlying strata, exposing the pale intrusions across regions like the Lac Saint-Jean complex in Quebec, which covers over 20,000 square kilometers. The extreme hardness of anorthosite resists weathering, leaving wind-scoured ridges exposed above the forest line across large swaths of eastern Canada. The second-growth forests of the St. Lawrence Valley, broad expanses of dense hardwood forest surrounding the St. Lawrence River, give the visual impression of ancient primeval woodland. Forest inventory data compiled by Natural Resources Canada reveals that over 90% of these stands represent second-growth timber. Commercial harvesting began in the early 1800s to supply the British Royal Navy with white pine square timber, driven by timber booms along the Ottawa and St. Lawrence rivers. Entire watersheds were clear-cut, and log drives floated millions of trunks downstream to timber ponds at Quebec City. Following the establishment of provincial forestry regulations in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, public lands were set aside for regeneration. The resulting forest structure consists of uniform-age stands of sugar maple, birch, and spruce under 150 years old, concealing former logging roads, stump lines, and abandoned skid trails beneath the leafy canopy. The origin of the geographical name Canada. The word Canada appears on every provincial map, federal highway sign, and official document. Yet its geographic application began as a simple linguistic misunderstanding. The term originates from the St. Lawrence Iroquoian word Canada, which translates to village or settlement. In September 1535, indigenous guides speaking to French explorer Jacques Cartier used the word to direct him toward the community of Stadacona, located at the present-day site of Quebec City. Cartier recorded the term in his journals and erroneously applied it to the entire surrounding region along the St. Lawrence River. By 1547, European cartographers began labeling the landmass north of the Gulf of St. Lawrence as Canada. Over 3 centuries of colonial administrative shifts and federal unification in 1867, a word that originally designated a single riverside village was expanded to cover nearly 10 million square kilometers of continental territory. Private land restrictions inside the Niagara Escarpment Plan. Landowners purchasing property along the Niagara Escarpment in Ontario often expect standard rural development rights. However, the Niagara Escarpment Planning and Development Act, passed in 1973, established a specialized land use control framework across a 700-kilometer corridor from Niagara Falls to Tobermory. The Niagara Escarpment Commission enforces zoning categories that severely restrict new construction, quarrying, and road building to protect the landform's ecological integrity. Within designated escarpment protection and natural areas, lot creation is tightly regulated, requiring specialized environmental assessments for minor site alterations. A property owner holding 50 hectares of forested ridge may be legally restricted to building a single-family dwelling, preserving open green space along a continuous escarpment edge through stringent legislative oversight. The natural recovery of the eastern wolf. Wildlife maps throughout the 20th century indicated that top predators had been largely extirpated from southern and central Ontario due to active hunting, trapping, and habitat fragmentation. By the late 1990s, genetic analysis conducted by the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources confirmed that small populations of the eastern wolf held on within Algonquin Provincial Park. Rather than relying on captive breeding or artificial reintroduction programs, the animals expanded their range naturally through wildlife corridors into adjacent crown lands and municipal boundaries. The provincial government responded by establishing protective legislation prohibiting the hunting and trapping of wolves and coyotes across 42 townships surrounding Algonquin Park, allowing a native apex predator to recolonize historic range across settled rural landscapes. The abandoned fire towers of the Canadian Shield. Climbing to prominent bedrock knobs across northern Ontario and Quebec often reveals rusting steel frameworks rising 30 meters above the tree line. Between 1910 and 1930, provincial forestry departments constructed hundreds of steel lookout towers on high topographic points to monitor vast timber reserves for wildfire smoke. Human observers lived in small cabins near the base of the towers for months at a time, spending 12-hour shifts scanning the horizon with alidades and telephonic landlines to relay bearings to regional dispatch centers. By the 1970s, the introduction of aerial reconnaissance patrols and automated lightning detection networks rendered the manual lookout system obsolete. Most towers were decommissioned, yet dozens remain standing on remote hilltops, preserving early 20th century forestry infrastructure within deep woods. The engineering of the Peterborough Lift Lock. Navigating the Trent Severn Waterway in Ontario requires boats to negotiate significant elevation changes along the canal network. At Peterborough, hydraulic lift lock number 21 addresses a vertical drop of 19.8 meters using no external electrical or mechanical pumps. Designed by superintending engineer Richard Birdsall Rogers and completed in 1904, the structure consists of two massive water-filled steel press chambers operating on a hydraulic balance system. When one chamber is loaded with an extra 30 centimeters of water, adding approximately 130 tons of weight, gravity forces the heavy chamber down, driving a steel ram that lifts the opposing chamber to the upper canal level. Operating continuously for over a century, the lift lock remains the highest hydraulic boat lift in the world, moving vessels purely through displacement and gravitational force. Glacial landforms of the Ridges Moraine. Stretching over 160 kilometers across southern Ontario, the Ridges Moraine forms an elevated ridge of sand and gravel up to 200 meters thick. Created approximately 13,000 years ago during the late Wisconsin glaciation, the landform developed as an interlobate moraine squeezed between the Simcoe lobe of the Laurentide ice sheet to the north and the Lake Ontario lobe to the south. Melting ice deposited billions of cubic meters of glaciofluvial sediment, forming kettle lakes, hummocky topography, and extensive aquifer recharge zones. The moraine acts as a natural water tower, filtering rain and snow to feed 65 clear water streams flowing north into Lake Simcoe and south into Lake Ontario, demonstrating how short-term glacial dynamics dictate regional hydrology thousands of years later. But what happens when industrial resource extraction intercepts these ancient hydrological layers? Historical logbooks of Indigenous guides. Early European recreational travel across the Canadian Shield depended entirely on local Indigenous knowledge and regional guiding networks. In places like the Temagami region of Ontario, Ojibwe guides such as Ignace Tonane mapped intricate portage routes and waterways connecting Lake Temagami to the Ottawa River watershed long before provincial surveyors arrived. Mining prospectors and timber cruisers in the late 19th century relied on hand-drawn route maps and oral directions provided by local guides to navigate dense spruce wilderness. Archives at the Canadian Museum of History hold original 19th century guide logbooks, recording specific water depths, portage distances measured in paces, and seasonal animal movements. These working records served as the functional basis for early Geological Survey of Canada map sheets, proving that what colonial cartographers published as newly charted land was systematically documented decades prior by local residents. Peat cores from Bloomingdale-style bogs. Walking off a forest trail in the Mer-Bleu bog near Ottawa, the ground yields underfoot like a saturated sponge. Geologists from the Geological Survey of Canada analyzed the subarctic microclimate conditions of southern peatlands by driving hollow aluminum core barrels 6 meters down into the sphagnum moss layers. Isotope analysis and radiocarbon dating of buried plant remains revealed that peat accumulation began approximately 8,400 years ago, following the drainage of the Champlain Sea. The continuous deposit of dead organic matter in cold anaerobic water created a self-insulating peat blanket up to 5 meters thick, keeping subsurface temperatures cold enough to maintain isolated stands of black spruce and carnivorous pitcher plants hundreds of kilometers south of their primary boreal range. Calamity and historical land survey records. Geological exploration in isolated wilderness zones frequently left permanent markers on cadastral mapping. In the 19th century, private mining consortiums and government surveyors recorded accidental deaths and equipment losses directly onto official field notebooks. The Geological Survey of Canada catalogued hundreds of field books from the 1840s onward, detailing specific geographic incidents that established place names across northern Ontario and Quebec. Surveyors used Gunter's chains, 66-foot measuring chains, and brass compasses to tie these localized events to fixed geodetic benchmarks, embedding tragic personal accidents directly into official geographic nomenclature preserved on modern topographic maps. The lost settlement of Cold River. Deep in the backcountry of the High Peaks region, written records and forestry surveys documented isolated homesteads that operated completely outside standard municipal structures. In the early 20th century, independent trappers and wilderness residents constructed log cabins and outbuildings far beyond municipal road networks, establishing self-sufficient homesteads that survived for decades without official property deeds. The Great Blowdown of November 1950, a massive storm system featuring wind gusts exceeding 160 kilometers per hour, flattened millions of trees across eastern North America, destroying remote structures and forcing long-term wilderness residents to abandon their claims. Subsequent aerial photography flights conducted by government agencies confirmed that the surrounding forest canopy rapidly reclaimed the clearings, leaving only moss-covered stone foundations visible to modern field researchers. Alpine crumholts revealed by core sampling. Botanists investigating the stunted spruce mats atop Mount Washington and high ridges in eastern Canada used dendrochronological microcores to determine the true age of crumholts formations. Using specialized incremental borers designed to extract tree rings without killing the plant, researchers sampled stems no thicker than a human wrist. Laboratory ring width measurements revealed that individual prostrate trees, standing less than 1 meter tall, were over 300 years old. Severe wind-driven ice desiccation annually kills any shoot growing above the snowpack boundary, forcing the trees to grow horizontally in dense woody mats anchored directly to Grenville Age bedrock cracks. The Six Nations land purchases at Onkiota. Maps of northern wilderness areas frequently depict large tracts of land as unpopulated state or provincial parks. In 2025, the Six Nations Iroquois Cultural Center completed a land transaction purchasing 243 hectares near Onkiota, adding to an existing 133-hectare holding. Cadastral title searches at local registry offices show that these parcels, previously classified as commercial timberland or private recreation tracts, were reacquired by indigenous organizations to establish cultural preservation sites and traditional gathering grounds. The transaction demonstrated that modern property records are actively shifting as First Nations reestablish legal ownership over ancestral land within administrative park boundaries. Lowland boreal refugia and thermal imaging. Aerial thermal infrared surveys conducted over central Ontario lowlands revealed unexpected surface temperature anomalies during hot summer months. While surrounding hardwood hillsides warmed to over 25 degrees Celsius, low-lying spruce bogs maintained ground temperatures below 12 degrees. Remote sensing scientists mapped these microclimates, known as lowland boreal refugia, where dense cold air pooling and thick peat insulation protect isolated populations of gray jays and boreal chickadees. Thermal sensors mounted on aircraft demonstrated that low-elevation hollows act as micro-climatic islands, preserving northern habitat types far south of their continuous geographic boundaries. Great Camp Sagamore and Gilded Age architecture. Architectural historians analyzing rural building surveys in the late 19th century documented a distinct structural phenomenon along secluded lakeshores. Wealthy industrial figures acquired massive timber tracts and commissioned multi-building complexes disguised as simple rustic cabins. Great Camp Sagamore, constructed in 1897 on Raquette Lake, comprised 27 separate wooden buildings designed with exterior bark cladding, massive stone fireplaces, and split log handrails. Architectural plans archived at historical societies show that beneath the rustic facade sat advanced infrastructure, including hydroelectric generators, underground telegraph lines, and complex water filtration systems, allowing urban luxury to function within an artificially constructed wilderness landscape. The breeding habitat of Bicknell's thrush. Ornithologists from the Canadian Wildlife Service identified the narrow geographic limits of Bicknell's thrush by deploying miniaturized light-level geolocators on captured songbirds. Weighing less than 1 gram, these instruments recorded daylight patterns to track the bird's migration from the Caribbean to specific high-elevation zones in Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. The data proved that the species nests exclusively in dense, wind-stunted balsam fir stands above 900 meters elevation. By overlaying GPS tracking data onto high-resolution digital elevation models, researchers mapped the global breeding habitat of the species down to isolated mountain ridges, covering a tiny fraction of the eastern Canadian landscape. Logging railway grades on LiDAR imagery. Airborne laser scanning, or LiDAR, has transformed forest archaeology across the Canadian Shield. In the Five Ponds wilderness, dense spruce foliage completely concealed early 20th century industrial logging operations from standard aerial photographs. When the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources flew high-density LiDAR surveys over the region, the laser pulses penetrated the tree canopy and bounced off the bare earth, generating high-resolution digital terrain models. The resulting images revealed straight, elevated earthen embankments, dry stone culverts, and rotting timber trestle abutments from long-abandoned narrow-gauge logging railways. What appeared on the surface as virgin wilderness was exposed on screen as a continuous industrial transportation grid built to supply mid-century pulp mills. But as advanced sensors map these forgotten networks, how do local populations live alongside these hidden industrial layers today? Territorial scale of Algonquin Provincial Park. Maps showing administrative boundaries across central Ontario depict Algonquin Provincial Park as a large green block spanning 7,653 square kilometers. That area makes the park larger than the entire province of Prince Edward Island, which covers 5,660 square kilometers. Established in 1893, the park boundary encloses thousands of freshwater lakes, 2,400 kilometers of canoe routes, and continuous habitat supporting wolves, moose, and black bears. Rather than operating strictly as an uninhabited nature reserve, the park contains working forestry zones where controlled timber harvesting continues under the Algonquin Forestry Authority, balancing commercial hardwood production with wilderness preservation across an area larger than several small European nations. Public property taxation on Crown land. Across most jurisdiction models, publicly owned land remains entirely exempt from local property taxation, creating potential fiscal deficits for rural municipalities. In Ontario, the provincial municipal tax grant system addresses this imbalance by providing compensatory payments to local townships containing significant Crown land acreage or provincial park reserves. Payments calculated by the Ministry of Finance allocate millions of dollars annually to municipal districts like Nipissing and Renfrew, offsetting the cost of maintaining local road networks, emergency services, and infrastructure that serve unpopulated backcountry zones. The state effectively taxes its own holdings to maintain the municipal solvency of surrounding rural communities. The remediation of Sudbury's acid-damaged lakes. During the mid-20th century, sulfur dioxide emissions from nickel smelting operations in Sudbury, Ontario, created localized acid rain that severely degraded surrounding freshwater ecosystems. Water sampling conducted by Laurentian University and Environment and Climate Change Canada in the 1970s recorded lake pH levels dropping below 4.5, causing complete loss of fish populations in over 7,000 regional lakes. Following the installation of the superstack chimney in 1972 and strict emissions reduction mandates under federal provincial air quality agreements, industrial sulfur output dropped by over 90%. Liming programs initiated by researchers involved adding thousands of tons of crushed limestone directly to regional lakes to neutralize acidity. By the 2000s and 10s, long-term monitoring confirmed that lake pH levels had recovered to near neutral values, allowing lake trout and aurora trout to naturally re-establish breeding populations across once-dead basins. Unmarked legal boundaries in provincial parks. Traveling across northern highways, drivers pass invisible administrative frontiers where local land use regulations change fundamentally without physical border checkpoints. Crossing the boundary of a provincial park or Crown Land Management Unit alters municipal planning jurisdiction, mineral staking rights, and hunting regulations instantly. The Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry enforces distinct Crown land use policy directives across neighboring management units. On one side of an unmarked boundary line, private timber harvesting and residential lot severances operate under standard municipal official plans. On the other, land development is strictly prohibited under provincial conservation legislation, proving that legal landscape protections function independently of physical barriers. The legacy of gray owl and wilderness conservation. In the 1930s, an individual known as Gray Owl achieved international prominence through books and public lectures advocating for northern Canadian wilderness and beaver conservation. Operating from a cabin in Riding Mountain National Park and later Prince Albert National Park, he framed northern ecology as an endangered natural frontier. Following his death in 1938, archival records and investigative reporting revealed that Gray Owl was actually Archibald Bellany, an immigrant born in Hastings, England, who had adopted an indigenous identity. Despite the exposure of his fabricated background, his published works and film recordings directly influenced Dominion Park's branch policy, accelerating early government initiatives to establish formal national park reserves across Canada. Constitutional protection under Section 35. Natural resource management and land use decisions across Canada operate under fundamental legal parameters established by the Constitution Act, 1982. Section 35 of the Act formally recognizes and affirms existing Aboriginal and treaty rights, creating a constitutional requirement for federal and provincial governments to consult with First Nations prior to approving industrial developments, mining permits, or park designations on traditional territories. Supreme Court of Canada rulings, including the Delgamuukwa and Silcotin decisions, established that Indigenous title confers legal ownership rights that require formal consent and accommodation. This constitutional framework means that geographic development decisions across millions of square kilometers of Crown land are subject to legal scrutiny and co-management agreements rather than unilateral government action. Permanent populations inside Canadian park boundaries. Standard wilderness management theory assumes that ecological protection requires the complete exclusion of permanent human habitation. Across Canada, numerous communities operate entirely within provincial and national park reserves. Towns like Banff and Jasper in Alberta sit inside national parks established in the late 19th century, housing over 10,000 permanent residents alongside commercial services, schools, and municipal infrastructure. Local governance operates under specialized leasehold arrangements managed by Parks Canada, which enforces strict residency requirements, ensuring that housing remains tied to local employment. These inhabited park centers demonstrate that municipal urban density and high-level environmental protection can coexist within a single administrative line. This leads directly to the core paradox that governs the entire northern landscape: Quetico, British Columbia, and the complete ghost town. In 1979, the AMAX Canada Mining Corporation constructed a modern, fully equipped municipality at the head of Alice Arm on the northern British Columbia coast to house employees for a massive molybdenum mine. The town of Quetico was built from scratch in less than 18 months, featuring 92 single-family homes, 7 apartment buildings, a shopping mall, a bank, a swimming pool, and a fully staffed hospital. In 1982, after just 18 months of operation, global molybdenum prices collapsed. The company closed the mine, halted production, and evacuated all 1,200 residents. Rather than dismantling the structures or selling off building materials, the entire municipality was preserved intact, complete with streetlights, paved roads, and manicured lawns, maintained by a private caretaker crew for over 4 decades. Quetico stands as a pristine, fully modern urban center sitting completely empty in the coastal rainforest, serving as an absolute monument to rapid resource boom and bust cycles across northern geography. What kept these anomalies unnoticed for so long was not their remote physical location, but the institutional habit of assuming that published topographic maps represent a finished picture of the Earth rather than a temporary snapshot. The ongoing work of measuring Canada's changing landscape continues across multiple scientific disciplines. Geodesists at Natural Resources Canada continue to adjust national elevation baselines as post-glacial rebound alters coastal sea levels, while glaciologists monitor accelerating glacial retreat in the St. Elias Mountains and high Arctic ice caps. Subsurface subsidence beneath historic mining districts like Cobalt and Giant Mine requires perpetual environmental oversight, and climate warming threatens to degrade permafrost foundations supporting infrastructure across northern territories before detailed geotechnical mapping can be completed. The map on the wall looks authoritative, fully surveyed and complete, but the dynamic bedrock and hydrological systems operating beneath it remain constantly in motion. Which geographic anomaly in your own province or territory has always struck you as the most unusual? Or which location in this countdown surprised you most? Share your local knowledge in the comments below, and subscribe to keep exploring the hidden geographic reality behind everyday places.